Hello, everybody. My name is Amy France, and I serve Gordon College as the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement from the class of 2001. We want to welcome everyone here for this special midday event. We are hosting a wonderful talk on the topic of From Gordon to the World, Taking an International Path. I'm very pleased to be featuring two wonderful alumni. And we have one of our beloved professors, Dr. Ruth Melkonian Hoover, who will be moderating our conversation. And I'd like to invite Dr. Melkonian Hoover to turn on her video to take over the moderation of our wonderful event. So I hope you all enjoy. Thank you. Hello, Ruth, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, all. So good to be part of this panel today. I'm delighted to introduce you to our esteemed panelists and Gordon alums. Sarah Petrin is a humanitarian and educator from Maine. She was born in an African village during a season of drought and has helped refugees since she was 15 years old. She has worked in more than 20 countries with the United Nations, the Red Cross, World Vision, and established her own organization, Protect the People. She currently teaches at the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and she holds a master's degree from the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University. She also has a BA from Gordon in International Affairs, African Studies, and French. She's also an adjunct professor of anthropology at Messiah University. She has just released her first book this week, about which she will talk today, Bring Rain, Helping Humanity in Crisis, and it just shot to the #1 new release for nonprofit books on Amazon. So very exciting. And Lisa Jo Baker is the best-selling author of 3 books and 1 Bible study. She grew up in South Africa, worked for Habitat for Humanity across Africa and the Middle East. And she is also currently co-host of the popular Out of the Ordinary podcast. She now lives just outside Washington, D.C. With her political science professor husband. And while she was at Gordon, she studied English and pre-law. You can connect with her on Instagram or Facebook at Lisa Jo Baker. So welcome, Sarah Petrin. Welcome, Lisa Jo Baker. We are so glad to have you here today. So if you could turn on your cameras as well.
Hey.
So Sarah, what inspired you to write this new book, Bring Rain, Helping Humanity in Crisis?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy and Ruth and everyone at Gordon College for hosting this event today. I'm so thrilled to join you and Lisa Jo for this talk about writing books and faith and friendship. And really, my book, Bring Rain, that just got to #1 on Amazon just yesterday for nonprofit books is so incredible. I have been writing this book for many years now. And I started when I realized that I had been working in the humanitarian sector for 20 years. I think, when I was a student at Gordon, I always used to wonder, what will my life be like and where will I go? And I thought, well, I should write a guide for young people who want to get into this work and tell them the truth about the good and the bad and the ugly of having a life of international service and working in a multicultural environment. And so the book is really 2 parts. One part is sharing my story of the places I've gone and the things I've done. And the other part is offering advice to people who want to make a difference in the world and who want to address big problems in bite-sized ways that are manageable and reasonable, given the complexity that we live in today. So I hope this book will be helpful to anyone who is involved in service in their community, as well as young people who want to go overseas and work in humanitarian emergencies.
That's great. I think you do just that in this book, which I enjoyed. Why did you choose the title for this book?
Yeah, so Bring Rain has a lot of different metaphors throughout the book, but initially I chose Bring Rain from a story early in the book where my family served in missions. My mom was a nurse and my dad was a teacher, and my mom was pregnant with me when they served in the village of Mumias, which is in Kenya, East Africa. And I was born in a year of drought. And when I was brought back from the hospital where I was delivered, the village elders held prayers and a rain dance to welcome me back. And they prayed that I would be a good omen and that I would bring rain to the village. And of course, I didn't have that power as a small child, brand new born. But from day one, this idea that people had hope and inspiration, that I would bring relief to many people, stayed with me for a long time. And that's where the title comes from.
That's great. Sarah, this is your first book. Lisa Jo, you've written 3 books and a Bible study. I tend to write articles. I've only written 1 book myself. I'm new to this realm. What is it like for both of you to write books? What are some of the glamorous and not so glamorous aspects of writing?
Sarah.
Yeah.
Do you want to divulge the deep, dark secrets of the book
Go
world?
for it, Lisa Jo, you start.
Well, I just feel so delighted to be here with you celebrating your book, because writing a book is such an accomplishment. I think when I thought about being a writer, I think sometimes we have this very romantic idea of what it means to write a book. Like you're going to somehow be in a snowy cabin and a fire, and it's very Hemingway, maybe a glass of wine or hot chocolate. And in my experience, it's nothing like that. It's like any other job. You have to show up and sit down in a chair and do the work. And some days it goes well, and some days it goes really, really slowly. And it can be really lonely, because so much of what a writer does is by themselves in their own interior world, which is why community is so key, I think, when you're writing. So being friends with Sarah and then getting to walk with her on this journey and being able to answer the phone anytime she said, this is so difficult. Why is this so hard? I don't know what I'm doing.
I did. Yes.
And just tell her that's completely normal. That's right. But I did think early on, I got the best piece of advice about writing. So anybody who thinks like, how do you write a book? What's that like? How do I even begin to write something that's 50,000 words long, or in Sarah's case, nearly 90,000 words long? If you're writing something that long, if you are somebody who's ever written a blog post, or for students that are watching, a paper for a professor, I mean, that's how you write a book. I had a friend tell me you write them 1 blog post at a time, or 1 article at a time. It's the best way to think about it. You never start thinking, oh, I'm going to write 50,000 words. I don't know if anyone would persevere. But if you think about a book as chapters with stories in those chapters, then you just think, okay, today I'm writing this chapter that has these 5 stories and these 5 themes, and this is going to be where I start. And so you just start story by story and you write it. And the next thing you know, you have written 50,000 words. But I do remember that feeling of initially it just feels like you wrote a Word document, you just have. And so then when this shows up in the mail, it's that really beautiful moment of like, oh, I wrote a book. Like what started out as a bunch of stories turned into a book in somebody else's hands.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I can also share a little bit about that. I think Lisa Jo is right in that you have to take it in bite-sized pieces. But what was super helpful to me was at the time when I had first compiled the manuscript for this book, I made a transition from Washington, D.C. to teaching at the Army War College. And I made a commitment to set aside 1 day a week to only do writing on the book. And this was super hard because pre-COVID, I was very social and I enjoy people. So to set aside a Saturday and not see people and just focus on writing was very hard. And then I also worked with a writing coach who helped kind of turn my more academic expert style into what we call writing for a trade audience, which is a public audience. So my book is not an academic book. It's not written for experts. It's written to bring all the humanitarian work and these complex issues into a very easy, readable format so that anyone can understand how people go about trying to respond to major disasters. So I think having someone that helps you make your writing better is such a wonderful thing. And Lisa Jo does this for other authors. She's a writing coach, and she's probably one of the best people out there to give people the truth about how much you have to adapt your personal style to what a public audience actually wants to read. And it is a painful process because you sort of do have to give up some of your own way of writing in order to make your words more accessible to a general audience. So I recommend working with someone like Lisa Joe, and my coach was David Hazard. He really helped me also in this process.
I'll add what I love about how your book turned out, Sarah, is it really does read like fiction. I mean, it's narrative nonfiction, but it reads like fiction. It's so compelling. A lot of the times it reads like a movie. I mean, you can see it play out in your mind, just these wild, wild stories of unbelievable situations you found yourself in places like Sudan and Southern Africa. And it is really compelling. So this is my plug for Sarah's book. I know that Amy's going to add a link at the end, but really get your hands on it because it's such a beautiful experience to step into the life of somebody who has been on the front lines in places the rest of us might never get to travel to. But I think so much of the motivation behind what you do is applicable here, like in our own neighborhoods. So it's one of the things I love so much about how Bring Rain turned out.
Oh, it really brings you there. One thing I really appreciated is that your book is kind of a helpful primer for those who want to enter into this sector, and you offer really practical advice. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I think that when you want to help others, whether you're serving at home or going abroad, you are going to face unexpected situations. Oftentimes you go into a problem and you think that the nature of the problem is one thing. And the more you look behind the surface, you realize that there's a lot more going on than what you think. So Lisa Joe talked about some of the stories that read like fiction. I mean, who could have imagined that, very early in my career that I was held hostage in the desert by a refugee camp leader who wanted to make me his wife. And this is one of the favorite stories of my coach, and it's kind of funny when people tell the story back to me, but at the time it wasn't funny at all. I had to figure out how to stay alive in this situation and how to get out of that situation. And this is a very common thing that people who want to help, they maybe don't have a full understanding of the environment that they're going into and the dangers that they might face, not only physical dangers, but dangers to their health and other things. And I really try to give people like the truth of what they might face. And certainly this is not only for going abroad, but serving in the US. I worked during Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. And I talk about volunteering in communities, even when I was younger in high school, and the unexpected things you learn from being open to what other people have to teach you about their life and their reality. And this is super important to have mutual learning in the work with those you're serving.
Yeah. And I appreciate your frankness as well in terms of what people are stepping into should they choose to follow this path. Could you give maybe even some practical steps that you think folks should be taking as they seek to prepare themselves and do the research before entering in?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really important is having not only a deep understanding of culture, but learning and studying culture and language before you go to a place. And then also being open to learning and understanding more when you arrive. And this goes for the United States as well as other countries. I mean, we have kind of what I like to call microcultures in the US, like pockets and microcosms of different neighborhoods and different communities. And certainly you have to have an open mind, and you have to be willing to listen to people and understand their needs from their perspective, and rather than making assumptions about what is needed. And this is a skill that you learn over time by doing assessments and getting a good education and all these things. So I think, doing your reading and doing your active listening and always being open to learn from others, I think is super important wherever you go. And I see Lisa Jo shaking her head too, so she probably has some ideas about this.
Want to add, Lisa Jo?
I mean, I think Sarah is such a wonderful example of what it means to really be mindful of where you are serving, right? Because I mean, I know some of the hot button topics today are, you know, we want to be so careful not to rush in as saviors into other countries. We want to be careful, cultural appropriation, how we speak and how we serve. I grew up in South Africa. Sarah grew up in Maine. We met at Gordon. And so one of the interesting experiences for me as a South African, I remember, was attending church services locally to campus and hearing about missions trips people were sending to South Africa. And it was a very unique experience to be on that side. And I think at first there was a defensiveness in me, but my parents are very involved in orphan care in South Africa and the AIDS crisis. And I remember talking to my dad about it and him saying, listen, anyone who wants to help, we will take their help. And I think that's part of the mindset that's always really served, I think, when we think about these kinds of opportunities to serve, taking the mindset of someone who's coming alongside to help, to serve, not to save. And I think that's what's always been really powerful about Sarah's approach to this work, as someone who comes in as an active listener who wants to participate in what the community is already doing and saying, how do we come alongside and serve you because you know best what you need in these spaces. So it's always felt really meaningful to me. And having had Sarah in my home in South Africa, I can testify to that firsthand.
That's great. I want to go back to this question of your friendship. Even just in the short time working together with the two of you, it's been great to see your dynamic interaction. And you, as you said, coming from Maine and South Africa, ending up together at Gordon. Could you share more about how you became friends and how your friendship has evolved over the years?
It's so funny. Lisa Jo and I, we were both at Wood Hall when we were freshmen. So, and we were both in a triple dorm. So Wood Hall is no longer, it's currently the Science Center. But we
We're so old.
Yeah, this was a while ago now. We're 20 plus years in our time at Gordon. And our dorm rooms shared a wall. So my bed was on one side of the wall and Lisa Jo's bed was on the other side of the wall. So we couldn't actually talk through the wall. So we developed this knocking system, you know, of like knocking on the wall to say, hey, are you there? Do you want to chat or whatever? I mean, this is before we were like texting, and I don't even think we had email when we were freshmen. This is so long ago. And I think that kind of knocking on the wall is a great metaphor for our friendship, because we've both lived in a lot of different countries and done a lot of different work. But, you know, whenever we needed each other, we could just knock and be available for the other person. And I think that's what Gordon does for people. Like, even if you're not in touch every day, you stay in touch and you maintain those connections. And if you need someone, you can just knock on their door or just send them a note and say, hey, you know, I miss you, I'm thinking about you. And Lisa Jo's been there for me when I've knocked on her door, and I really want to thank her for that.
I know it's really amazing to those alum that are listening. I'm sure you can think of people like that in your life. And if there's any students that are tuning in today, I mean, the people that you think you're just trying to put up with or survive, or, you know, you don't really know them well, it will surprise you how time can pass and they can just constantly be woven in and out of your story. And Sarah has lived overseas a ton, more than I have. I was home in South Africa for a while and in Ukraine working there, but Sarah has been constantly on the move. But what's been so beautiful is that when those relationships form so early in such formative time in your life, they become this touchstone you can keep returning to, especially when you're passionate about the same things. And so Sarah and I, our lives have continued to intersect, whether in Washington, DC or in South Africa. We've had those moments. And then throughout Sarah's humanitarian career, what's been really fun, Sarah, for me personally, is you've kind of come over into my career a little bit now with writing. And so we can continue to knock on the wall and learn from each other. But those relationships really do become transformative and real lifelines for years, for decades, that it's so fun to be able to testify to.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
And Lisa Jo mentioned this as well. We live in a context in which people are increasingly fearful of engaging in global crises, given past mistakes in the international humanitarian sector or within missions and so on, and fear being perceived as or acting like a white savior, for instance. So how do you maintain your own vision for how to effectively and appropriately engage in your mutually transformative work?
Thanks so much for this question, Ruth. It's something that is significantly shifting the whole sector right now, is this questioning of the whole premise of having outsiders come in to help, when we know that the most transformative community work is done on the ground by the people themselves, with their own agency and their own resources. And that change that is most transformative comes from within a person and a community and a country. So that kind of begs the question, what can outsiders do? And I think that the first thing to recognize is understanding your own cultural identity. I think particularly in the United States, we're still kind of trying to figure out what it means to be a white person. And I think for those of us who've lived and traveled abroad, other people teach us this all the time. I mean, like every time you go somewhere in the world, there's a different word for a white person. And sometimes this can be a very friendly word, and sometimes this can be a very negative word, like you are the oppressor. And then you have to talk about that openly all the time, every day in your work. And you have to learn the way that people perceive you. And you have to build trust with people so that they see you as a friend and someone who cares about them and is there to offer mutual support. But I think in the United States, we need to come to our own understanding of our own history as white people and what that has done in terms of our foreign policy, and also the relationships within communities in the United States, urban and rural communities and Black and white communities and immigrant and brown communities and Asian communities, all these things to raise awareness within ourselves, so that when we act, we do it in a way that is genuine and sincere and honest, is very important. Because if you go out there and you don't have an understanding of who you are going to be put in your place. And some people will run away, and some people might do damage also to the communities that they're trying to serve by not treating them with mutual respect and care. And so we need to avoid this. And we know that there's a long history of damage that's been done. And undoing this damage takes a lot of hard work and soul searching, particularly for people that are of white racial backgrounds and of Western cultural backgrounds. But we have to do this work ourselves of learning and unlearning behaviors that are harmful to others, and journeying on in a spirit of partnership and friendship with one another.
And I would add too, that just being aware of, like you talked about, that we're Western. I mean, that we're, you're American, like coming as a white American versus coming as a white South African versus coming as a white person from England. Like all of that brings different stories with you. There's a narrative that we're not aware of. I always compare this, when I came to Gordon, I remember I had this really strong South African accent that people would comment on all the time, but I would say, I'm not the one with the accent, you are. Like, it was strange to realize I have an accent. No, you all have an accent. And I think I keep that in mind when we travel. We tend to assume ourselves as the norm and everybody else is different. And so understanding our own stories that we bring, like our accents, our background, our country, our culture, the time and place we're growing up. And as Sarah says, it's the communities we walk into who really make you aware of those things you haven't paid attention to before. So the more we learn about our own stories, the better we are at appreciating and then coming alongside the stories of other communities.
That's helpful. You both encourage us in your work to keep faith in humanity, in part by relying on our own faith and in part by other sources of inspiration and the network of support you've built between yourselves and many others. Could you expand on that? I mean, Sarah, you describe situations of such pain and trauma into which you're entering or you have experienced. And so how do you maintain hope in the face of such hopelessness?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Oftentimes, when we were reviewing this book, Bring Rain, with students before it got published, a lot of people said that their favorite chapter in the book was the one about keeping faith in humanity. And this is the faith chapter in the book that talks about the fact that God is capable of doing his or her own work in the world that is far beyond what we can do in our limited capacity as human beings. And faith is something that helps us see the bigger picture when we are faced with our own limitations. As Lisa Jo said, we are not the saviors. We can't fix everything. We can't change everything. We have to accept our own limitations. And for many people, this leads them to become kind of jaded after they've served for a long time. And it doesn't matter whether you're serving in the church, in a local ministry, and you're constantly pouring out your heart for the needs of people, or whether you're serving overseas in a crisis, people that are constantly pouring out, they need something that pours back in and fills them up. But if they keep taking on the burden on their shoulders, they are going to get burnt out. And even if you're trying to not get burned out, if you're working with people in trauma, you are going to experience vicarious trauma. And sometimes you might need counseling. There's another chapter in the book called The Dark Night. After one of my colleagues was assassinated, it took me a few years to recover in my own heart before I felt happy again in my life. And we're coming up on the anniversary of his death, and almost every morning I wake up thinking about the songs we played for his funeral. So these types of traumatic experiences, they stay with us. And we have to believe that God sees the bigger picture, but we also need to seek help when we ourselves are affected, and we need support. You know, you need your family and friends, but there are times in your life when you experience a crisis and you are going to need help, maybe the help of a professional. None of us are so strong that we can do everything ourselves. And this is not a go it alone business. This is the type of work you need to be in a good team of people. You need to work for a good organization. This is not the type of thing that you should go it alone. You need other people and you need diverse perspectives to make your work effective.
I don't know, Lisa Jo, is there anything you would like to say in that regard?
It's such a powerful answer. I just agree. I guess I can just give some concrete specifics. Two examples come to mind. One is I grew up as a white South African during the heart of apartheid, during the state of emergency. When I arrived as a freshman at Gordon in 1994, Nelson Mandela had just been elected president. So it's hard to fathom it was that recent, right, that our country was still perpetuating the evil of apartheid and institutional racism. And post his election, we held what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission across South Africa, where perpetrators came and testified to the acts that they had done, terrible acts of violence. And reporters were covering this. And it was so interesting at the time, the South African reporters traveled with the commission for 3 years. The international reporters were coming and going. So the South Africans were exposed day in and day out to these terrible stories over and over, and would just have breakdowns and be weeping. And there was a quote in one of the journals that the international reporters said, "Oh, we can't get anything done because the South African journalists keep bursting into tears." And it was such an interesting statement about what it means, not just to hear trauma, but to recognize the trauma you've caused, because we had to bear witness to what had been done by the white minority to the African majority. And so therapists were brought in for the journalists to help them in their work. And I think as human beings created in the image of God, that kind of reaction to that kind of injustice is appropriate. That is how we should feel. We aren't trying to get to a place where we are no longer affected by what we see or the work we do. Instead, we, in those moments, I think, really enter into the heart of God and his reaction to sin and injustice. And so I always encourage people doing this work, you're not trying to get to a place in your career where you're no longer impacted by that. Instead, you're trying to put healthy systems around the work you're doing so you can both feel the grief and the deep injustice, but you can find ways to cope through it so that you can continue to serve and be effective.
Yeah, can I follow up on that too?
Yeah, powerful.
That Lisa Jo's comments really remind me about another reason why I wrote Bring Rain. And the truth is that working in a crisis is not for everyone. And this book will help you discern whether that is for you. And I think of a very short story I tell in the book about a young man who went to work in Darfur during the ethnic cleansing and genocide there. And he lasted 3 days in Darfur because there was no water. There were very limited food supplies, and there was active violence and armed conflict going on. And this young man didn't work for me, but worked for one of my colleagues, and is a great story to tell because after 3 days, he called the organization and said, get me out of here, like get me out. And so I think, you know, we all like to think we can withstand adversity and we can deal with any kind of thing. But the truth is we all have a human reaction to things going on around us. And so you have to really discern your own capabilities to manage the intensity of what you're getting yourself into.
I have to add one last thought, because if you're watching this and thinking, oh my gosh, that's never going to be me, but you have a heart for social justice, there are many ways to show up. And I think especially what's happening in the US today with what feels like the second civil rights movement we're in the middle of, if you are on social media at all, you have a platform, you have a voice, you have a way to serve, you have a way to amplify other stories and to show up in meaningful ways that don't require you to have a passport or to get on a plane. And I always remind my own children of that, you know, my teenagers, pay attention to what's happening in the world today and how are you participating? How are you actively amplifying the stories of other people that we need to hear? So I think there are many, many ways to participate when it comes to social justice. I think clearly it's a call that God gives all believers, and it'll just look different for all of us. So Sarah's book is, I think if you read it and realize, whoa, that's not for me, but you still have that burning in your heart, that's the Holy Spirit saying, well, guess what? Like you get to take that message too, no matter where you are, you know? And so whether you're in Maine or you're in Johannesburg or you're sitting in Wenham, Massachusetts, you have a smartphone, you have a platform, you have a voice, and we get to use those voices on behalf of others.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, if you could use the Q&A function, and we'll open it up to you in just a few minutes. Sarah, I wanted to ask, you have done so many things and worked with so many different kinds of organizations. You started an NGO, Protect the People. You've worked with the UN. You've worked with World Vision. You've worked for the Red Cross. You've worked for NATO. I'm going to miss something. Most recently, as military to protect civilians. And so
Yeah.
you've chosen to engage with so many different agencies and organizations to affect change.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that, Ruth. As Lisa Jo said, there are so many ways to affect change. I think the first thing you need to try to discern is, you know, what kind of problem are you motivated by? What kind of issue do you want to address? And there's so many different ways of going about it. You don't have to become a humanitarian worker. I mean, Lisa Jo was an attorney and practiced law before she started writing books. And you can see from what she said already what might have motivated her to study law and think about legal justice for people. And there's so much you can do for human rights. And I love what she said about the second civil rights movement. Maybe it's like the third and fourth are still needed in our own country. So I think that there's so many different things you can do. And with the pandemic and COVID now, we see so many first responders in the medical community. It's just amazing the variety of work you can do. But for me, I have always been motivated by one principal thing, and that is the protection of people from harm. I have always been motivated by protecting people from physical violence and from physical danger. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. And I think part of that is because I was a victim of violence when I was a small child. And the book tells that story as well. And after I came out of that recovery, I really felt like I wanted to help other people who felt powerless, who felt fearful, and to help people survive the trauma of physical violence. And I think that we live in a world where people don't realize how much violence affects so many communities. We see it now with gun violence. And in the last few years, terrible gun violence in the US. We have communities of people who see hundreds, maybe thousands of people die weekly in conflict zones around the world. And in my last role at the War College, I analyzed violence in more than 20 different war zones. And every day or every week or every month, my mind was with one team or another team in a different operation, trying to help develop strategies for keeping civilians safe from danger. So that has been my motivation. And a large part of that has been working with refugees who are fleeing violent conflict and people who are leaving their home because it's no longer safe for them to live there. And after working with refugees for many years, I realized, how can we make conflict less deadly to start with? And that's when I began doing work with the military and trying to work with police also on training them for de-escalating violence and mitigating harm to people in very difficult circumstances.
Lisa Jo, I know you've also done a lot of work with refugees. I don't know if you can help us understand your connection as well and how you got involved in that work. It's work that's near and dear to my heart.
Sure. So I came to Gordon and to the States to study, to get a law degree is what I wanted to do, and went to law school and always had a passion for international human rights. Having grown up under apartheid, I think that's how you end up feeling like, how do I make a difference? I remember my mom at the time when I was a small child, and we witnessed just the terrible brutality of apartheid, me saying to her, what do we do? Like, we have to go and talk to the police about this. And she's saying to me, the police will not do anything. If we want to make changes, we have to change the law. The law has to change in order for there to be justice. And so it was my big motivator to go to law school. And so I spent several years in Ukraine working for the UN there on their anti-human trafficking projects. And I always say, if there's students listening, to encourage them. I know it can feel intimidating sometimes when you hear people rattle off like all the very fancy places they've worked, and you think, wow, like, how do I go from my dorm room where I have COVID protocols and I can't even like intern in the way I used to maybe a job I really aspire to overseas. And I'll just share, I started out working in Chicago for a big litigation firm and realized that isn't what I wanted to do. And my husband got an opportunity to go to Ukraine on a fellowship that he had. And so I arrived like this American lawyer who had a heart for justice, but didn't know what to do. I just started attending briefings and press events, and the US Embassy would hold different events, and they held a conference on anti-trafficking. And I sat in on it, and I heard the chief of mission of the International Organization for Migration speaking and describing the work they did, where they were working with law enforcement to craft new laws to help prosecute traffickers in Ukraine, which is a huge export country into the forced trafficking world. And I just thought to myself, I got to work for them. I have to. And I mean, he's like this big important guy. Nobody knows who I am. I just waited. I wanted to talk to him. He had this huge line of people waiting to speak to him. And he was not interested in talking to me. And I just outweighted that man. I just sat on a chair and awkwardly stared at him as he had all these dignitaries talking to him. And I'm not joking. I must have been there for like an hour at least after his presentation. When he was finally done, I'll never forget, he turned to me and like sighed and he was like, okay, like, what is it? You know, random woman. And I said to him, hi, my name is Lisa Jo Baker. I am an attorney from the US. I'm here for 10 months. I'm passionate about human rights. I'm looking to volunteer. And his whole demeanor changed. And he looked at me and said, really? Can you start on Thursday? And that's the story of how I got one of my favorite jobs of all time. I started as an intern. You know, I had been a corporate attorney. I showed up, they gave me a little office. 3 months later, they put me on contract and I became a counter-trafficking legal specialist with their team. We were only going to be in Ukraine for 10 months and we ended up staying 2.5 years because of that job. And so my encouragement is, if you feel passionate about something and the Lord is leading you into something, be curious, be willing to work for free, be interested in what other people are doing. How do you come alongside? What does it look like to offer your gifts into this work without an expectation of return? And in my experience in the international community, the work is so difficult that it's a very tight group of people who really admire people who are willing to come and say, how do I help? You know, and I think a lot about Isaiah, like, here I am, send me, you know, what does that look like? And there really is a way to do that in the modern world today that, in my experience, will lead us to opportunities we couldn't have got to just on paper.
Yeah, no, that's great. You were equipped and you were persevering. Wow. Great. That's great. Sarah, there's a question from one of our alums, Ben Henry, who's asking, what is it like kind of being a Christian working within a large IO like the UN versus working in smaller secular NGOs, or maybe not necessarily smaller, but secular or Christian NGOs? How's that experience?
Thanks for asking. I think in the international humanitarian community, there are probably only about 10,000 or so professional relief workers, like globally speaking, right, who do this as a career. So people do specialize, like Lisa Jo specialized in law, and I specialized in refugee crises and cross-border operations. So when you have the desire to help, you have to actually develop a technical skill and specialize in an area that allows you to function in a particular role. So a lot of your experience is determined by what your technical area is. And when you are a generalist or you're first starting out, it is important to be willing to volunteer and to learn and to serve and to grow. But as you specialize, you tend to focus on the agencies that do the type of programming that you are working towards. So that's why I did my graduate studies and my master's in refugee studies at Oxford, because I realized, well, I want that to be my technical area. So let me go back to school and get a degree in that. But it's true that among this international community that in general, there's not a lot of appreciation for organized religion as a positive influence in the world. Just as much as we question Western influences overseas, I think for many humanitarians, they see religious differences and distinctions as a source of division. And so you often see maybe not the same relationships between faith-based agencies that are working overseas with the more larger institutions and the UN. And sometimes people kind of suspect your motives, if you are overly Christian and seen as proselytizing people and have a more missional spirit. So this is just very specific to the sector, because we have principles of universality and neutrality and principles of non-discrimination, which means we, as humanitarians, we work with all faiths and we work with all human beings, regardless of their race or gender or sexual preference or anything. Like, the only thing that qualifies you for help in a time of crisis is being human. So those distinctions for the humanitarian community are kind of falsehoods for them that just kind of, you don't think about that. When there's a crisis, you save lives and you help people regardless of their background. But there are a lot of great faith-based agencies that are working in the humanitarian sector. And so really what matters most is what you want to do for your specialty area. And if you feel that you want to work with a faith-based agency, there are many good ones, and I've worked with World Vision. I've worked with the International Catholic Migration Commission, with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. But the way those organizations go about their work is quite different than like the Red Cross or the UN that don't have a faith orientation. But ultimately, it is true that regardless of whether you work for a Christian agency or a large institution, if you're going into a crisis, you have to treat everyone with respect and dignity and with equality. And there's just no exception to these rules in our line of work.
There's just add one thing though. I will say, Variant. Oh, I'll be quick because I know there's a bunch of questions. I just like one specific example that was really meaningful to watch. I found that a lot of the times people were curious that I was a believer, particularly when we look at the kind of evil that you deal with. They're curious about why you would have faith. And part of when we worked with trafficking or anti-trafficking, I kept saying, why are churches not involved? Like, why aren't we educating churches? Because in certain countries, right, the church plays a huge role in people's daily lives and they are going to church. Like, how are we going to get those churches involved? And we hosted, my boss thought I was insane, like the chief of mission. I was like, how do we get in the leaders of every faith group we can think of here? Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Jewish, evangelical, Muslim, like, can we just like bring them all in because they're in the villages anyway? Like, people are showing up in their communities and we need to help them know how to identify trafficking. And my boss, who was working with the former KGB on a daily basis, informed me he thought it would be more risky to bring together these faith groups. Wow. And I kept saying to him, if we don't have the churches involved at the local level, nobody's going to the former KGB to report these things. They're talking to like their priest or the rabbi or the imam. Like, we have to, these people need to be educated. And I remember my boss telling me, I just think this is insane, but we'll try. And we did. We had like 35 different faith traditions represented in this one conference room. Our staff was so terrified, and they dealt with like criminals and, you know, like very high government officials, and they were like, what do we say to them? How do we talk to them? Like, they were freaking out about it. But it was the most beautiful day. We had a group of the most diverse religious leaders I've ever spent 2 days with, who sat and listened and learned alongside one another. So I would just encourage you as a believer, I think that's like an added thing we bring to the table. It isn't something to be ashamed of or to hide, but you know, when used in the way that Christ encourages us to do, I actually think it's a really beautiful thing to be able to add. And my boss used to talk about that for years afterwards. Like, it was so insane. We had all these religious people in one room and nobody got angry. Like, he couldn't believe it.
Beautiful. That's great. This just gets down to the questions of preparation. What about your Gordon experience? This is from Sam Schreiner. What about your preparation at Gordon, or your Gordon experience perhaps prepared you for the fields in which you are now engaged?
Yeah, I'll go for that. There's a few stories in Bring Rain in my book from Gordon, but really my favorite one comes from a class that I took with Dr. Ivy George on women in world politics. And I believe I was a sophomore and her class was only for upperclassmen. So I begged her to let me get into the class before I studied abroad, because I knew when I was at Gordon that I wanted to study abroad my junior year. And I wanted to go to a country that was experiencing a refugee crisis, so my internship could be with refugees. And I took her class, and she gave a lecture on the meaning of patriarchy, which surprisingly, I had really never heard this word before in my life. And I really didn't understand it. And in the book, I share the definition of patriarchy and how it has led to gender inequality throughout the world. And we had this discussion in class where everyone got to choose a country to study, or a situation in which patriarchy was affecting women's lives. And at that time, the Taliban were just beginning to take over parts of Afghanistan, like town by town. They were taking over control. So I did my study on how subjugating women was part of the strategy for terrifying the population and controlling the population. And when I gave my presentation in class and I said, this is, they're stoning women to death in public squares for reading, for being educated. I'm like, this is the worst form of patriarchy I can possibly think of. And, Dr. George challenged me because she's like, well, that's kind of extreme, and patriarchy is a lot more subtle than that. But who would have known that a few years later that I would go to work for the UN in Afghanistan, and I landed in Kandahar on the southern part of Afghanistan as still a young person working with the UN. And when I first saw all the women in burqas in need, and I had the money and the resources and the team and the authority to help them, I cried. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, here I am, and here they are. And this is real life, that you think you're studying something in a book, but when you're curious about the world and you're willing to go out there, you find yourself face to face with the truth of the reality, is that there are people in need everywhere. And, Lisa Jo talked about Ukraine and the trafficking of women in Ukraine. And I also have had the privilege of working in Ukraine, but in a different capacity. And these issues are real, and there are people on the other side of these problems, and they need something, and we can be part of the solution. We are not the solution, we are not the savior, but we can be part of partnering with others and making the world a better place, and everyone can do something. So I think whatever you're interested in and studying at Gordon, just watch out, because if you're sincerely wanting to get out there, like Lisa Jo said, God will take you straight to the source of the problem and put you right smack in the middle of it. And then you will be amazed at what is possible when you're willing to do that.
What a trajectory. Lisa Jo?
I know there's a bunch of other questions, so I'm happy to just take the next one.
Okay. There is a question that I see here from Martha Petrin about what are some of the ways that just on a daily basis, how you keep yourself healthy, emotionally, mentally.
Right. I mean, there's probably 1,000,001 answers to that, and they're different at different times in my life. Like, honestly, sometimes I just binge Netflix because you're tired, like everybody, right? But I have recently been challenged. I've been reading the Message version of scripture that does like the message in 100 days. And so I kind of went back to the beginning, and it was really interesting. They're talking about Noah in the days of Noah, and God was talking about the sin that he saw in the world. But what was really interesting is he wasn't talking about behavior. He says, all the thoughts were evil and all the imaginations were evil, 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 evil. And it struck me so much that our thought life, our imaginary world, what we put into ourselves is something I think we discount. And we live in a society that is preaching to us all the time through the TV, through the media. And I think we have to really discern. And so what I've had to learn, especially in these days where the media is so loud, I really have to spend a lot more time letting God preach to me than I do like my device preach to me. I think that's been one of the most important sources of my own spiritual health. I think it's really important to have all kinds of thought leaders that we're listening to. I think it's important on our social media that we're listening to people of different races and ethnicities and backgrounds and stories and countries. I think sometimes just pull up, like, who are you following on social media, and are they all like you? And there's a very quick, easy way to change something tangibly right now. Start listening to other people. And I just thought in that quote, I was so challenged myself you know, in a different way at 46 than I was as a 20-year-old at Gordon, but it's the same call from Christ. Like, what are you putting into your mind? And Gordon is trying to feed your mind. It's trying to preach to you. And when we go into the world, my teenagers hate this about me. I'm always asking them when they show me some new TikTok or some new musician that they love or viral clip. And I like all that stuff. They bring it to me, but I always ask them, what's it preaching to you? Like, what does it want you to learn from this? And I think we have to be really intentional about who is preaching to us the most. And so have to keep going back to scripture and seeing what Christ says and what does he model and what do his disciples show. Spending time making sure that the biggest narrative in my life is not Instagram. Is as weird as that sounds, really is radical in this day and age. And so for me, a lot of it is making sure that the voices in my head are coming from the right place when I think about the work that we're being asked to do.
Yeah, I would love to add to that, although Lisa Jo's like on point exactly with what she had to say. And I haven't been on social media as much as she has because I've been working with the military a lot, and we have restrictions during the day on our what we can use on our devices. But I'm slowly getting back in and learning myself. But there are two things really that I think are really important. And one I talk about a lot in the book is having a support network. And you really need two different types of support networks. You need a close circle of friends, and you need a good professional network. And when I supervise young people in the workplace, I think sometimes they confuse the difference. So you need to make sure that you have close friends that you can share your personal life and stories with, and family, and lean on them for support. But your professional network should be people that you respect, people that you schedule time with, and that you are intentional about helping, having them help you grow in your career. And this is so important. And I lean on my support network all the time. Like, my friends know what's going on in my life and how they can help me. And my work colleagues know when I'm changing jobs or want to shift something in my career, or if I'm having a particular challenge, you know, they're willing to talk to me about it, maybe anonymously, you know. And this kind of network is so, so very important. And then I always say, take care of yourself first. I think as someone who has supervised teams of people in emergencies, the worst thing is when a member of my team has an emergency and then my focus shifts to taking care of them instead of taking care of the crisis itself. And sometimes those emergencies are things that, you know, like if you have a medical condition or you're sick or you're not well, take good care of yourself. You know, drink water, see the doctor, take rest, take your vitamins. All these things are so important to take care of yourself first. And, you know, when you get on a plane and they say, put your own mask on before helping others, I mean, that's really my message. Like, put your own mask on, take good care of yourself. If you're not feeling good and you're not doing well, if you have a need for support, for care, you know, take care of yourself first, because it's from a place of fullness that you can give to other people. And we all need to be filled, whether it's spiritually filled in the way that Lisa Jo's talking about by consuming the right messages, or whether it's having a good diet and good exercise. You know, all of these things are within our power to be at a place where we're ready for service. And sometimes we're not. You know, there have been times in my life where I've had to come away from being overseas and take a break for a year, for sometimes longer, because I just needed that for myself. So know yourself, know your needs, take good care of yourself, love yourself as you would love others. But don't forget to love yourself first. It's very important.
Well, this has been really encouraging and challenging for me, and I'm sure for all these folks listening. And I would recommend, again, to go deeper. So many great accounts and great resources and good, encouraging and challenging words that we need to hear. Thank you.
As I just wanted to jump on to wrap up, thank you so much to Sarah and Lisa Jo for choosing to share all of your stories with Gordon, with your alma mater. We're so grateful for you leaning in to share that with us. But just also your model of, one thing that I kept hearing kind of in the back of my head was your model of sacrificial courage in the different ways God has called you. I just feel like that has been woven through both of your stories and then woven together as well. So just that is such a beautiful testament to what God has done to launch you from Gordon and the ways he has used you in the world. So thanks so much for sharing that. And Ruth, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for moderating this conversation. You were such a great fit to diving in and leading into Sarah's book and this wonderful relationship between two dear alumni. We're just so glad for you to take the time to do that. I will put in the chat the link to Sarah's page, which will bring you to her book, as well as the Amazon link to all things Lisa Jo. So feel free to check out both of those, both Sarah's page and then Lisa Jo's page as well. And I see somebody has already ordered something on Amazon. So that's really wonderful. Thank you for that. And thanks to all of our wonderful guests, students, faculty, staff, alumni, friends of the college. It was great to have you with us over this kind of lunch hour. We're really glad to have had you with us, and we will be announcing probably next week a few folks who will be probably winning a copy of Sarah's book as well. So thank you all for coming together today for this. So with that, I thank you and want to say goodbye and have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Ruth, and happy
you.
birthday.
Thanks, you guys.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so
Happy
much.
birthday. Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.
Take care all.
Bye.